Hello and welcome to the dev talk of the game The Warehouse. The Warehouse is a 3D puzzle solving game developed in the Unity game engine. The main focus of the game is having the player learn to play the game with as passive feedback as possible. This is mainly done by using visual cues for the player to learn the game. To see how this is done, we will play through a few levels to show you the implementations. Start off, we have a simple menu for the game with a play button, select levels since there is no saving and loading, and a quit button. So if we go into select levels, we can see here we can select each level to play, and each button that is interactable with lights up with a background, as can be seen here on the number 8. And let's go back and let's start playing level 1. So loading into level 1, we're immediately greeted with the warehouse aesthetic. And on the left hand side, we can see W, A, and D keys integrated into the texture of the level. And this is to indicate to the player to try these keys out without explicitly telling them what they do. But if the player tries them out, we can see it's the basic movement for left, right, forward, and backwards. Moving forward in the level, and rounding this corner, we're greeted with a yellow guardrail that we can't move through. But on the right hand side here, we have another visual cue for the player to try out. If the player presses space, they can jump. They can now jump over and on top of objects. And moving on the other side of the guardrail, we have this door with a warp fieldy yellow particle effect and an exit sign. These two is indicating an exit of the level, and the yellow particle effect draws the player into the next level, indicating there's something beyond. And the exit sign is integrated into the level, and with the aesthetic to not draw too much attention and not explicitly telling the player this is an exit, but doing so in an intuitive way with the level's aesthetic. And if we move through it, we can see we're loaded into the next level. So loading into level 2, if we move forward and around this corner, we're immediately greeted with a closed exit door and a big red button. If we jump upon this big red button, the door is activated and open. If we jump off it, the door closes. And we can see the activation and deactivation of this red button by jumping on it. The button goes down when activated, and it goes up when deactivated. But simply standing on the button and running forward to the door is not enough for the player to solve this puzzle. So we want them to explore the room in each level to find a solution to their current problem. So if the player looks around, they can see a cube and another visual cue in this corner. So if we move forward to this cube and put our cursor on it, changes color, showing that it's interactable with. So if we press the E key, we can pick the cube up and move it around, and it collides with other game objects. And it can also be dropped with the same E key. So I wonder if we can put this button on the big red button. Let's try it out. And the button goes down, and the door is now open. And we can exit into the next level. So these few first levels have been introductory levels to teach the player the ropes of the game, how they can move around, how they can interact with objects. And at this fourth level, they're now starting to get a little bit warm in their clothes. And we want the players to experience more of the game and combining the things they've learned to complete a level. So in this level, if we check out, we're greeted with an open door, a platform on the other side, some sort of red light with a cable attached to it. So if we follow this cable, we can see it moves along the roof and down to some sort of battery perhaps that doesn't seem to be turned on at the moment. So we can try to jump the gap, which fails. The wall is too high to be jumped over. So we have to go back up the stairs. And here we have a window with some sort of gun. So we want the player to go and look at gun, and it changes color just like the cubes, indicating that it's interactable with. So if the player picks up the gun, it is now equipped to them. And here's another visual cue indicating that the gun plus left click equals a gun that fires some sort of projectile. So if we try it out, we can fire a projectile that explodes into some sort of electrical or plasma field. I wonder if we can activate this battery with our newly found electrical gun. We fire the projectile towards it. We can see that the battery has now been activated by applying a visual cue to the battery, giving off a glowing effect showing that it's charged. And if we follow the cable back to the light, it's changed from red to green, indicating that something's been activated. In this case, the moving platform that now moves back and forth. So we can jump on it and hitch a ride onto the other side, and we can now exit the level. The following level gets harder to give a sense of progression for the player, allowing them to use their basic knowledge that they have accumulated in the introductory levels to now apply to more advanced level that gets added to the game. And if we check at this level, we can see we don't see as much at the beginning, but we see some sort of hole over here. And if we go to explore it, we can see a pressure plate, and we can't jump down here because the game is safeguarded against players getting stuck. So they are now reset with a fade to black and then a fade back to give some sort of visual cue that they're being transported back, instead of just teleporting them immediately without any sense of direction. And if they explore this level, they can find a lever, platform, with a cube on top of it, connected to a light that shines red. We're connected to a cable that goes to a battery. Activating this battery lowers the platform, allowing the cube to be used and put down into this hole, activating the pressure plate and then activating the door, allowing the player to exit towards the next level. Another example of how the player gets visual feedback on how the world might be interacted with is here in this level, and this tube specifically. It has some sort of wind effect flowing downwards, showing the player that some object might be falling down or floating downwards in this tube. And further exploring this level shows this tube that has a wind effect flowing upwards instead, indicating that some object might float upwards in this tube and then go downward in the other tube. To further expand on the game's progressiveness, we can see in this level that we have 4 colors of lasers shooting out from the wall. And they seem to be ordered in some kind of pattern. And if the player continues to explore the level, they can find the same colored cables as the lasers connected to 4 different batteries. And here we want the player to find the correct solution to this pattern by checking the lasers and finding out that, oh, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4 from the beginning to the end, and then activating the batteries in that same order. And now that we've looked a bit on how the visual feedback is presented to the player and how a bit of a progression system is implemented into the game, I just wanted to take a moment to explain why we've done it this way and not in some other way. And that's mainly because we don't want to bombard the player with overwhelming information at the beginning of the game. In many other games, they are presented with a lot of text boxes or a manual of some sort with pages and pages and pages of information and videos on how to play the game, how to interact with different systems and subsystems and so on. And often there's a lot of information that's not relevant to a new player. So that's why we've taken this approach to introduce the player bit by bit to the relevant elements of the game at that time. So for example, we start with learning how to move, but we do this in a non-intrusive way by having it integrated with the game world instead of adding it with a text box or something that pauses the game to give the player that information. And we continue doing this throughout the levels to give them the basic knowledge on how to play. We then give them more feedback on how to use objects or how objects behave and interact when the player interacts with them. And then we also start the game with a slow approach by, as I said, having the movement, to then adding the gun, to adding interactions with objects and adding interaction with batteries and so forth throughout the game to make it progressively harder and making the first puzzles easy and the later puzzles more challenging throughout the game. So now we will talk a little bit more about the technical aspects of the game. As I stated in the beginning of this dev talk, the game is developed in the Unity game engine, and I developed it single-handedly during the course TDDD23 at Linköping University. I chose to use the Unity game engine since I wanted to try and make a 3D game, which is a little bit harder than compared to 2D game development. But I still wanted to try it out. So I choose Unity for the great support that it has in its community, with a lot of help, being able to get on the forums or searching for help how to do specific things and finding information quickly, as well as the great asset store of free assets available to a project as mine, since I wanted to focus more on developing core mechanics and functions for the game to run smoothly, and focus more on having the player learn the game in a non-intrusive way instead of focusing time on developing assets. And using Unity hasn't just been a walk on roses. There's been both ups and downs during this development period, mainly because I've never worked in Unity before, so it might have been a better choice to start with a simpler 2D game instead of a 3D game, but I like to take on a challenge. So there was a lot to learn during this project, mainly how to use Unity itself, because you have both the game objects that goes into every scene, the C# script, and not that I'm not used to writing C# code, but you have to use so many of the built-in functions with the game engine and physics engine and different functions that not just part of the regular C# libraries. So there was a lot of learning period going into that, what to use and when to use it, and also how things interacted with each other in the engine. For example, you have the game objects, and then you apply all the C# scripts to these game objects, but then you also need the game object A to interact with game object B. So you have some scripts on game object A that needs access to game object B, so you have to connect them together or connect the scripts on game object A to the world. And this posed a challenge to learn, so there was a lot of time spent in testing areas, seeing how things worked and what didn't work. Although spending all this time in testing areas and learning how to use the Unity game engine allowed me to better develop the game and make it flow better and reduce the amount of bugs and make it a more enjoyable experience for the player. So a lot of the time spent in testing then went into developing mechanics that flowed well during the game and nice scene transitions. And I also spent great deal of time having help with playtesting. So I got the help of a friend to come in and test play the game at various stages, and just observing to see what they did and what they got stuck on and what they had to say about the different features or mechanics. So I discovered a lot of problems that I didn't think of myself when I developed it. So, for example, you could jump on the cube while you were holding it and then continue jumping and moving around and floating around in the game world instead of just being able not to jump on the cube and use it as a floating disc. So that was really time well spent using friends to help me playtest the game to see things that I didn't see to make it better and a more enjoyable experience for the players. Thank you for listening to this dev talk about my game, The Warehouse.